For weeks now, Israel's war on Gaza has been described by scholars and activists as genocidal. But at the end of December, South Africa became the first country to make that case formally to the International Court of Justice. The Israeli government has responded aggressively. Here is Israeli government spokesperson Eylon Levy.
The State of Israel emphatically condemns South Africa's decision to play advocate for the devil and to make itself criminally complicit with the perpetrators of the October 7 massacre. On October 7, South Africa openly aligned itself with the Hamas rapist regime when it blamed Israel for Hamas's violation of the ceasefire and covered up Hamas's crimes against humanity. It is now aiding and abetting that machinery of genocide. In giving political and legal cover to the October 7 massacre and the Hamas human shield strategy, South Africa has made itself criminally complicit with Hamas's campaign of genocide against our people. It shares culpability for the tragic loss of human life. The State of Israel will appear before the International Court of Justice at The Hague to dispel South Africa's absurd blood libel. How tragic that the rainbow nation that prides itself on fighting racism will be fighting pro bono for anti-Jewish racists.
How disgusting that the rainbow nation, which fought against racism, would accuse Israel of genocide. Maybe it's not a coincidence, right? Maybe it's not a coincidence that the state, the nation that fought against apartheid and won, is now taking the lead when it comes to trying to hold Israel to account, the other apartheid state, right? And you heard Eylon Levy there say, South Africa's decision to play advocate for the devil. Now that's a pretty crazed style of language to be using from a government official, and it couldn't be further from the measured forensic case that South Africa builds against Israel in its 84-page submission to the court. They're asking the court to impose, quote, provisional measures to prevent Israel from carrying out further genocidal acts against the Palestinians in Gaza. This is how the filing begins. The acts and omissions by Israel complained of by South Africa are genocidal in character because they are intended to bring about the destruction of a substantial part of the Palestinian national, racial, and ethnical group, that being the part of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip, Palestinians in Gaza. The acts in question include killing Palestinians in Gaza, causing them serious bodily and mental harm, and inflicting on them conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction. The acts are all attributable to Israel, which has failed to prevent genocide and is committing genocide in manifest violation of the Genocide Convention, and which has also violated and is continuing to violate its other fundamental obligations under the Genocide Convention, including by failing to prevent or punish the direct and public incitement to genocide by senior Israeli officials and others. Now, defending Israel against those claims, we can show you spokesperson Eylon Levy again, who went on to say this.
While the Hamas rapist regime does everything to maximize civilian casualties with its despicable human shield strategy, Israel is employing measures unprecedented in the history of warfare to minimize civilian casualties. We have been clear in word and in deed that we are targeting the October 7 monsters and are innovating ways to uphold international law, including the principles of proportionality, precaution, and distinction in the context of a counter-terror battlefield no army has faced before.
It's like watching a pantomime, isn't it? It's just like, how sort of hyperbolic can he get in his language when they're the country committing genocide, right? In my opinion. How do those claims he made there stack up against the evidence South Africa has compiled? Well, Levy mentioned the principles of proportionality, precaution, and distinction. But the death toll in Gaza now stands at over 22,000. That's according, of course, to the Gazan Health Ministry, whose numbers always add up. Around 40% of those killed are children, and thousands more Palestinians are believed to be under rubble. It's very difficult to see how that kind of slaughter could result from an operation conducted with precaution, precision, or distinction. And as the South African case points out, Israel continues to engage in the killing of Gazan civilians, including children. There are now countless examples of this, including Israel's bombing last week of a neighborhood of Rafah, which Israel had called safe. 20 Palestinians were reported killed in the attack, and among the injured was this young girl buried in the rubble. She survived, but in a single day, 210 Palestinians were reported killed across Gaza. South Africa also accuses Israel of, quote, imposing measures intended to prevent Palestinian births. This includes the destruction of health services crucial for pregnant mothers and newborns. On Tuesday, Israel bombed a hospital in Khan Yunis. UN worker Gemma Connell gave this report to the BBC.
This afternoon, I went to visit a hospital, the Al Amal Hospital in Khan Yunis, just a little bit north. It had been hit by a strike this afternoon. There was a huge hole in the wall. The strike killed at least 5 people, including a baby Zachariah, who was just 5 days old. And the scene I can only describe as horrifying and heart-shattering. Diapers on the floor, clear evidence that babies, had been living there. And just a few hours before, people celebrating the birth of Zachariah, just 5 days old, and now he's dead.
But it's not just killing civilians that South Africa accuses Israel of. It also says Israel is inflicting serious bodily and mental harm on Palestinians in Gaza, including children. And it says that Israel is creating, quote, conditions of life intended to bring about their destruction as a group. On Boxing Day in Rafah, 80 unidentified Palestinians killed by Israel's bombardment were bulldozed into a mass grave. The bodies had been brought south from northern Gaza, where they were killed in Israel's ground offensive. Imagine the mental strain. You're a refugee living in a tent far from home. You might be bombed at any moment. And if you are, you risk nameless burial in a mass grave. Also cited in the filing is mass displacement and the destruction of homes and neighborhoods, leaving nowhere for Palestinians to return to. This footage, shot in the final days of 2023, shows tents in Rafah, where thousands of internally displaced Gazan refugees have tried to find safety. Of course, there is no safety in Gaza. And this is what those refugees have fled. This was once a neighborhood in Tal al-Zatar, that's in northern Gaza. Now it is unrecognizable. These scenes are replicated across the north of the territory, with more than 2/3 of buildings destroyed. The Norwegian Refugee Council reckons that clearing the rubble alone will take at least a year, while rebuilding just the destroyed housing will take 7 to 10 years. South Africa also cites Israel's siege, accusing the country of, quote, deprivation of access to adequate food and water. In Rafah, there are long queues for the little food that's crossing the border from Egypt. And according to the UN, half of Gaza's population is now starving. And with lengthy triple inspections imposed on aid trucks, as well as almost constant bombardment, Israel appears to want to keep it that way. But South Africa's most general claim is that Israel is responsible for the destruction of the life of the Palestinian people in Gaza. This appears to be something Israel is now doing remarkably casually. This was the Al-Maghazi refugee camp after Israel bombed it on Christmas Eve. More than 100 Palestinians were reported killed in the blasts. The attack on a crowded residential block was described as a massacre. This is how Israel responded to that claim.
What is your understanding as to what took place there on Christmas Eve?
My understanding is, as a military spokesperson has told Israeli television, an incorrect munition was used in that strike. We, of course, do our best to be targeted and precise and to target the Hamas terrorists and do everything to get civilians out of harm's way. And it appears that in this mistake, in war, a mistake was made, and we are learning lessons.
We are learning lessons. We're admitting to our mistakes. You've killed 22,000 people, 40% of them children, right? Now, a mistake where you kill 100 people, right? That's not just any old mistake. It's also a mistake that can only happen in the context of a war where you are bombing people constantly, right? If you're dropping all of these bombs on a civilian population, then you are going to make some mistakes along the way. But also the idea that they're only killing civilians by mistake, I mean, the numbers do not lie. And we're hearing so many Israeli politicians saying that making life impossible in Gaza is part of the project. That is part of the project to get people out of the strip. Not necessarily so Israel can annex it, maybe, but so they can see the problem of Palestinians in Gaza as gone. That's what they want. Now, a final feature of South Africa's case is that Israel has repeatedly failed to punish officials who make genocidal statements. These include those involving mass relocation, like this reported by the Times of Israel. Israeli officials are currently reported to be in talks with countries, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, to serve as destinations for the, quote, voluntary migration of Gazans. Now, of course, that migration wouldn't be particularly voluntary when your homes, livelihoods, and families have been destroyed. And when you're constantly trying to avoid bombs falling from the sky, right? You cannot call that migration which was done by choice. The Jerusalem Post has also reported this from Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich in the past day. He's accused all 2 million Palestinians in Gaza of wanting to murder and rape Israelis. That is genocidal language. Smotrich is just the latest Israeli government or military official to try to justify genocide in Gaza by demonizing Palestinian civilians. On Sunday, he also called for the removal of Palestinians from the territory to make way for Israelis who could, quote, make the desert bloom. So that's language that was sort of common in the original Zionist movement. He went on to say this: let's think out of the box. If in Gaza there will be 100,000 or 200,000 Arabs and not 2 million, the entire conversation on the day after will look different. So that's what I've been talking about, changing facts on the ground. What Israel wants to do is change facts on the ground in the heat of war. So afterwards they can say, oh yeah, I mean, we didn't really want to do this, but we're not going to bring them back now, are we? Obviously in a peaceful, normal situation, it's going to be very difficult to get the international community to agree for the mass expulsion of 2 million people. But if you can say, oh, this was just an accidental consequence of war, and now it's happened, we didn't want to kick them out, but now they're out. Why would we let them back in? That seems to be Israel's strategy. The US has called these statements inflammatory and irresponsible, but so far not a word from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And of course, the United States will keep arming Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu to the teeth. So them calling them inflammatory, I have absolutely no sympathy, no respect. I'm not remotely impressed when the United States says, oh, this language is inflammatory. If you think it's so inflammatory, then stop arming the country, the army, doing it, right? No one cares if you condemn this or that statement. What matters is that you are materially supporting this being carried out. You are materially supporting a genocide. Oh, they've used some uncouth language. Who cares? What we care about is the reality that 22,000 people have been killed with American bombs, with American support. So the evidence of genocide is strong, but will South Africa's case make any difference? Francis Boyle is a US lawyer who won a genocide case against Serbia in the ICJ following the Bosnian War. He told Democracy Now! How he expects the case to go and what the wider implications might be.
Based on my careful review of all the documents so far submitted by the Republic of South Africa, I believe South Africa will win an order against Israel to cease and desist from committing all acts of genocide against the Palestinians. And then we will have an official determination by the International Court of Justice itself, the highest legal authority in the United Nations system, that genocide is going on. And under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, all contracting parties, 153 states, will then be obliged, quote, to prevent, unquote, the genocide by Israel against the Palestinians. Second, when the World Court gives this cease and desist order against Israel, the Biden administration will stand condemned under Article 3, Paragraph E of the Genocide Convention that criminalizes complicity in genocide. And clearly, we know that the Biden administration has been aiding and abetting Israeli genocide against the Palestinians here for quite some time. This has also been raised by my friends in the Center for Constitutional Rights and in the National Lawyers Guild in a lawsuit against Biden, Blinken, and Austin. So I believe we will be able to use the World Court order. Right now, my sources tell me the hearing will be January 11, January 12. Based on my experience with the Bosnians, we can expect an order within a week.
South Africa has now confirmed that the initial hearing with the International Court of Justice will take place on January 11th. I'm joined now by Ash Sarkar. I know that neither of us are sort of experts when it comes to sort of the workings of the International Court of Justice or international law. I mean, it does seem very significant to me, though, that this was, well, one, that we are now sort of discussing a legal case of genocide. It's not just being talked about by scholars, but a state has brought this to the International Court, and also the state who has brought it. So it is South Africa. That does seem quite significant to me, symbolically at least.
There's an added layer of symbolism when you consider the history of relations between South Africa and Israel. When South Africa was an apartheid state, it received significant diplomatic support from Israel, and that support was a two-way street. It's always been, I think, a matter of embarrassment for Israel that the claim that it is maintaining an apartheid regime over the occupied West Bank is one which has been supported by not only South Africa, the state, but the individuals who participated in the anti-apartheid movement and who helped usher South Africa into a democratic era. One of the things that you often hear from apologists for the Israeli state is that to call it an apartheid state is an insult to the severity of what went on in South Africa, whereas actually South Africans who lived under apartheid saying, no, what you are doing is apartheid. I think something which I want to talk about is the utter gross hypocrisy and the callousness that exists in much of British media when considering this allegation that what Israel is doing in Gaza is both genocide and a failure to prevent genocide, because it is a series of actions which is intended and is resulting in the destruction of a substantial part of the Palestinian people. I was on BBC Radio 5 last week because I'm really bad at taking time off work. And one of the individuals who was on the panel with me is someone who is sort of positioned as something of a foreign affairs expert. In one section, we were discussing Ukraine. It'd been the night after a significant barrage of bombing by Russia against the city of Kyiv. I believe 16 people were killed, and every one of those 16 civilian deaths is an abomination, right? Each one of those civilians didn't deserve to die, and each one of those civilians is evidence of a war crime committed by the Russian state. And this was something which this particular individual, this foreign affairs expert, was very happy to say, quite unequivocally. He said, this is happening because Russia wants to cause as much suffering to the civilian population of Ukraine as possible. The next topic was Gaza. And he just said, well, that's urban warfare. I don't want to minimize the suffering of the Palestinian people, but it's urban warfare. Everyone knows that's really difficult. So a conflict which has killed about 10, 11,000 people in the space of 2 years, that is rightly being condemned. But a completely asymmetric bombardment of an open-air prison, which has killed at least 22,000 people in the space of 3 months. Oh, that's urban warfare. Don't want to minimize the suffering, but I guess that's war. And I refer to it as ethnic cleansing. His excuse was, well, it can't be ethnic cleansing because these aren't people who are being forced across borders. And also, the Israeli army drops leaflets. Now, one, the definition of ethnic cleansing has never been the displacement of people across borders. There's such things as internally displaced persons. The crime against humanity of forcible transfer, again, it doesn't have to be across borders. And secondly, as you pointed out, Michael, yes, the IDF has been instructing civilians to leave particular areas. That's not to go to safe areas. The New York Times investigation has found at least 200 occasions in which civilians have been killed after being instructed to move to an area that they have been told to move to because it was supposedly safe. Now, that is not the actions of an army which is trying in any meaningful way to prevent the loss of civilian life. This is an army which wants to do the bare minimum to secure the diplomatic cover of Western nations, and in particular the United States. It's got nothing to do with the preservation of life at all. And what is deeply frustrating about the way in which the South African indictment of what Israel is doing in Gaza has been reported in the British press has been almost like something of a tiff. So, Israel is outraged at this very substantive legal argument being made by South Africa. It is presented as if it is just a mudslinging match rather than a proper attempt to use the institutions that we have, which are intended to try and uphold and implement international law to try and stop a crime against humanity in its tracks. And that is, I think, a failure of, I think, a baseful duty to truthfulness amongst the British media. I think it speaks to the deep pro-Israel bias that exists within British media. And I think it also speaks to a profound racism against the Palestinian people, which renders their suffering minimal compared to the scale on which it actually exists.
So many of our audience will have seen significant people in the mainstream media and politicians. All of our leading politicians essentially seem to have a very different approach to Palestinian lives to Ukrainian lives, right? That doesn't mean they should start valuing Ukrainian lives as lowly as they do Palestinian lives. It means that we should raise up everyone so that we sort of recognize that actually universal human rights matter. Just a clarification, I know you said 10 to 11,000 people have been killed in Russia's war on Ukraine. That's the civilian casualties. Now, of course, in law and ethically, we might say killing civilians is worse than killing military. But I think people in the Ukrainian military, or people in most militaries, they haven't always chosen to do it. I mean, in Ukraine, they definitely haven't chosen to do it because they've been conscripted to do it. So that's why if you start a war of aggression, I do think you're responsible for the military people you kill as well as the civilians, even if it's not sort of the same kind of war crime.